Hey everybody, and welcome back to the second part of our lecture for the respiratory system. So in this lecture, we are going to talk about the physiologic aspects of the respiratory system. That is, how does the respiratory system actually work? So we're going to start out talking about lung volume to pressure relationships. And then in each of the subsequent videos following that, we'll talk about respiratory volumes, gas exchange, and also gas transports in the body. So let's go ahead and get started with this second section. So I'm going to start off showing you guys a pretty short video. This video is pretty much going to be the summary of what we are going to talk about in detail over the next couple of videos. This video came from Bioflix, which is a Pearson Publishing product. And so, but I think it does a really nice job since I used the Marieb textbook when I'm creating my lectures, and because the pictures in there and the explanations I think are just excellent. I use the instructor resources a lot when I am creating my PowerPoints, and this came from the Bioflix instructor resource, but it's a really good video. It summarizes pretty much everything we're going to be talking about in this video and in following subsequent videos, and it gives you a really nice kind of, I guess, movie, if you will, of kind of the different processes that are happening. So let's go ahead and watch this.
Whether you're racing in a triathlon or doing something less strenuous, you need to breathe in oxygen to help you get energy, and breathe out carbon dioxide, a waste product. When you inhale, your diaphragm and rib muscles contract, increasing the volume of your lungs. When you exhale, these muscles relax, decreasing the volume of the lungs. When the lungs expand, air pressure in the lungs drops, causing air to flow into the lungs. When lung volume decreases, air pressure increases, causing air to flow out of the lungs. Air enters the nose or mouth, moves down the trachea, and goes into the two bronchi. Air moves down smaller and smaller bronchioles until it reaches a tiny sac, an alveolus. Each alveolus is surrounded by capillaries. Oxygen diffuses from the alveolus to the blood, and carbon dioxide diffuses from the blood to the alveolus. As blood flows through the capillary, it becomes rich in oxygen. In the blood, oxygen diffuses into a red blood cell and binds to hemoglobin, a protein made up of 4 subunits. One oxygen molecule can bind to each subunit. Oxygen-rich blood flows from the lungs to the heart. Which pumps this blood to capillaries all over the body. Here, we see oxygen diffusing from a capillary's red blood cells into a muscle cell. Oxygen is used by the cell's mitochondria to produce ATP during cellular respiration. Carbon dioxide is released. How does carbon dioxide leave the body? Carbon dioxide diffuses from cells into capillaries. Some carbon dioxide stays in the plasma, the liquid part of the blood. Most carbon dioxide, however, enters red blood cells. Some carbon dioxide binds to hemoglobin, The rest is converted to bicarbonate, which diffuses into the plasma. This oxygen-poor blood flows back to the heart, which pumps it to the lungs. There, carbon dioxide diffuses from the plasma into the alveolus. Bicarbonate enters red blood cells and is converted back to carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is also released from hemoglobin. Carbon dioxide diffuses out of the red blood cells, into the plasma, and into the alveolus. When you exhale, air flows out of your lungs. And that's how you release carbon dioxide, get oxygen, and keep on running.
So I think this video just provides us with a really good media production, if you will, of what exactly is going on. It gives us a really nice visual. So now let's talk about each of those different things that the video talked about in a little bit more depth. And so we're going to start talking just in general what respiration actually is. So respiration actually just consists of 4 processes. The first process we'll discuss is pulmonary ventilation. And pulmonary ventilation consists of inspiration, where air moves into the lungs from the atmosphere, and expiration, where air moves out of the lungs and back into the atmosphere. So together, inspiration and expiration is called ventilation. Moving from there, external respiration refers to the diffusion of gases at the level of the capillaries in the lungs. So each alveolus is wrapped in capillaries, and so oxygen is going to diffuse from the alveolus into the blood, where it's going to bind to those red blood cells, the hemoglobin on red blood cells. And then carbon dioxide that was in the blood is going to get dropped off in the lungs, and then we're going to exhale that carbon dioxide. So that is external respiration. It's gas exchange in the lungs. Then, of course, once we have oxygenated our blood, we send it through systemic circulation, and we have internal respiration, in which the oxygen is going to be dropped off to the tissues and the blood is going to pick up CO2. Then we're going to go back through systemic circulation to pulmonary circulation, which we're well aware of after the heart lectures. So this middle section here refers to the transport of respiratory gases, which is accomplished by the cardiovascular system. Okay. So we're going to talk about each of these different things in more detail, and in this video specifically, we're going to talk about breathing mechanics and ventilation. So volume changes cause pressure changes, which causes air to move. So in this section, we're going to talk about the importance of the partial vacuum that exists in our interpleural space, talk about Boyle's law and what that is and how it relates to respiration, talk about the roles of our respiratory muscles and the role of a lung elasticity or compliance in producing the volume changes that cause the air to flow in and out of the lungs. And then we'll talk about some different physical factors that can influence pulmonary ventilation. So first and foremost, before we start talking about the lungs, we have to first discuss atmospheric pressure. And we have to discuss this because when it comes to the lungs and the pressures in the lungs and surrounding the lungs, they are all relative to atmospheric pressure. So atmospheric pressure describes the pressure that's exerted by the air, specifically the gases in the air that are surrounding the body. So at sea level, this is about 760 millimeters of mercury. And the other way to write it here is 1 atm. Now, as you increase altitude, you can see there are fewer gas molecules above you. And so this is going to decrease the pressure. So the sort of picture I have here for you is if you're on the beach, like at the bottom of a mountain on a beach, you have all of these gas molecules above you that are pressing down on you. So this is a pretty high pressure that's pressing down on you. As you climb the mountain, if you're standing, maybe at the top of the mountain, see how there's just far fewer gas molecules above you? This is going to mean that there's less of a force pushing down on you. So therefore, this is a lower pressure situation, okay? So as I mentioned already, respiratory pressures, they're always described relative to the pressure of the atmosphere. So atmospheric pressure is 760 millimeters of mercury. But when we're talking about the respiratory system, we're going to describe this as being 0. Okay, so respiratory pressures are relative to atmospheric pressure. So if atmospheric pressure is 760, this is kind of our base point. This would be 0 respiratory pressure. 0 respiratory pressure describes a pressure in the respiratory system that is the same as atmospheric pressure. So one place that this exists is the interpulmonary pressure, or the pressure inside of the lungs. Although it does fluctuate with breathing, it always normalizes with atmospheric pressure. And this should make sense because you can see there's basically an open pathway between inside of the lungs and outside of the lungs, so in the atmosphere. And so these two values are always going to want to equilibrate with one another. So that is what I mean by 0 respiratory pressure, meaning that in terms of respiratory pressure, it's 0, which is equal to the absolute pressure of 760. Now, if I describe something as being a negative respiratory pressure, that means that the pressure in that particular area is lower than atmospheric pressure. So for example, intrapleural pressure, which is the pressure between the parietal and the visceral pleura of the lungs, is, as you can see in this picture, is -4. What this means in terms of absolute pressure, this means that it's 4 below atmospheric pressure. So if atmospheric pressure is 760, 4 below that is 756. So even though I'm calling it negative pressure, a pressure of -4, really what that means is that it's just 4 below our atmospheric pressure of 760. And then of course, positive respiratory pressure would mean that it's above atmospheric pressure, okay? So I just wanted to clarify that before I get too far into this. So we are going to now talk about these different pressures that are existing in the lungs, and we're going to talk about intrapulmonary pressure, interpleural pressure, and then what we call transpulmonary pressure. So first and foremost is intrapulmonary pressure, and intrapulmonary pressure is also called intraalveolar pressure. So this is just the pressure that's in the alveoli inside the lungs. So just to make a note of that, this is pressure in the lungs. Pressure in the lungs. And again, as I mentioned, this does fluctuate with the breathing cycle, but it always eventually equalizes with atmospheric pressure. So they always equilibrate with one another. And so the normal value for the pressure in the lungs is 0 respiratory pressure, which is again equal to atmospheric pressure or absolute pressure of 760, okay? So that is the pressure that's inside the pink spaces here, okay? All right. The next pressure is what's called the interpleural pressure. And the interpleural pressure is going to be the pressure that exists between the two pleura, so between the parietal and the visceral pleura. So in this diagram, let me get out my drawing tool here. So in this diagram, remember I said the pink part is the lungs, So the pink part is the lungs. And then the visceral pleura would be the covering that is directly lining the lungs. Okay. I'm going to try to outline it the best I can, the quickest that I can here. All right, so I just drew in what is the visceral pleura. And then just like in the heart, we have a cavity or a space between the two pleural layers. And then we have, so the cavity is going to be this gray space. And then we have what's called the parietal pleura, which I'm going to draw that as well. Best and the quickest that I can. Okay, so I drew the parietal pleura in blue here. Now, the intrapleural pressure is going to be the pressure that's in this space between the visceral and the parietal pleura, or the pressure that's in this pleural cavity. And yes, it's true that this one also fluctuates with breathing, but it's really important to understand that this is always a negative pressure. So a negative pressure meaning that it is always below atmospheric pressure. And although it does fluctuate with breathing, it's always about 4 below atmospheric pressure. So the intrapleural pressure, as we can see, is less than, it's negative relative to the pressure that's actually in the lungs. And therefore, it's below atmospheric pressure. So I want to sort of take a second to discuss why intrapleural pressure is negative. Because this concept might seem kind of maybe a little bit confusing or not super understandable. So why is intrapleural pressure negative? There's a couple of different reasons. So the first reason is that there are opposing forces that are kind of tugging on the lungs. And so the lungs are kind of, in a sense, wanting to recoil or wanting to collapse, but also being pulled back out. So first and foremost, there's 2 inward forces that make the lungs want to collapse to their smallest size. First and foremost is elasticity or recoil of the lungs themselves. The lung tissue is quite elastic. So kind of like a balloon, they will always assume the smallest size that they possibly can when they are at rest. So that would make the lungs want to recoil. All right, so that's going to make the lungs want to assume the smallest size that they possibly can, right? So that's one force inward. Additionally, in our alveoli, so if I were to, I'm going to draw a giant alveolus here. So in our alveoli, we're going to pretend that this is an alveoli. There is actually some fluid that lines the the alveolar surface, if you will. So I draw that in a little bit. All right, so the surface of the alveoli, just inside the alveoli, has a little bit of fluid. And this actually will make, erase those little pieces there. This makes the alveoli, because the fluid is attracted to itself, this makes the alveoli want to collapse because the water wants to get closer to itself. And if you think about this on kind of a grand scale, if all of the alveoli collapse, then ultimately what happens is the lungs would collapse as well. So there's also that force kind of tugging and making the lungs want to collapse to their smallest size. Now, in contrast, there's also an outward force that tends to pull on the lungs and make them want to stay expanded. And that outward force is the elasticity of our chest wall or our thoracic wall. And if you kind of think about this, it makes pretty good sense. So as you can see in this picture, the pleura, specifically the parietal pleura, is adhered to the chest wall. So whenever the chest wall expands, the diaphragm moves down, the chest wall expands. It's basically going to pull the lungs with it. All right, so it's going to pull the lungs with it, and that's going to keep the lungs inflated. So like when you're breathing in, you can feel your chest wall getting bigger, right? This, because the parietal layer of the lungs is directly adhered to the thoracic wall, this tends to pull the lungs outward as well. All right, so you have these opposing forces, and these opposing forces tend to create a negative pressure space here. The most influential reason, however, is, let me just erase some of the stuff. So the most influential reason is the fact that there is fluid in our pleural cavity. So our pleural cavity is lined with fluid. All right, so I just drew a little bit in there. Now, the fluid basically acts like glue between our parietal and our visceral pleura. So let me draw that in again. Remember, here's our visceral pleura. Here's our parietal pleura. The fluid in between is like the glue that is wanting to keep the two pleura close to each other. It's kind of like whenever you put a drop of water between two glass slides. The glass slides do not want to come apart because there is that really strong adhesive force due to the presence of water. This really strong adhesive force creates a negative pressure environment in which it's going to pull on the lungs to keep them partially inflated at all times. Okay, so this is kind of why there is a negative pressure that exists in the interpleural space. Finally is transpulmonary pressure, and transpulmonary pressure just describes the pressure that actually is keeping the lung spaces open. And the bigger this transpulmonary pressure is, the larger the lungs will be. So for example, or I guess to clarify this, transpulmonary pressure is just the difference between the interpleural pressure and the intrapulmonary pressure. So for transpulmonary pressure, it's just the difference between the two. Because there is a difference between the two, this actually is what is causing the lungs to stay open. If they were equal, the lungs would actually collapse. So because this partial vacuum, if you will, exists in this layer, it kind of sucks on the lungs and keeps them partially inflated. Now, it's kind of like, so let's think about this for a second. Let me just draw this little quick example. Pretend like you have, I don't know if I can draw this super well, but I'll try. Here is your sweeper. Okay, here's your vacuum at home, right? So here's your sweeper at home, and you've detached the hose. Okay, you've detached the hose. So here's the hose. Here's the hose to your vacuum at home. When you take the hose and you put it up against something, it sucks it in, right? Sucks it into the hose because you're creating a negative pressure inside of this hose. That's kind of what the interpleural pressure is. And because, so the best way to explain it, there's a if you're using the hose, the stuff that you're trying to use the hose on is the same as atmospheric pressure. And the hose that you're using is a negative pressure. So it creates like a sucking type force that's going to suck things into the hose. The only reason that you can suck things into the hose is because of this negative pressure here. The same sort of thing exists in the lungs, in which there's a negative pressure here in the pleural cavity, which kind of sucks on the lungs and keeps them inflated. But if you were to turn off the vacuum, you can't suck things up, right? The same situation in which if you get rid of this negative pressure differential, so if you were to make these two equal, the lungs no longer get pulled outward. Instead, now they're going to have their natural tendency to recoil and assume their smallest possible size. So here's where I bring up the idea that the negative intrapleural pressure has to be maintained in order to keep the lungs inflated. Okay? So here's a further way to explain that. Atelectasis is lung collapse, and this can be caused by a few different reasons. For example, it can be caused by plugged bronchioles, which causes the collapse of alveoli. And plugged bronchioles, this might be something that is seen after a patient has pneumonia. Their bronchioles can become plugged. And then this other word, pneumothorax, is when there is air that has actually breached the pleural cavity. And this might occur from either a wound in the parietal pleura, or if the visceral pleura were to rupture. So the example that I show here that the textbook shows as well is, say there's like a puncture wound to the chest wall that has breached the parietal pleura and has now entered this pleural space or the pleural cavity. Because now the pleural cavity is exposed to the outside air, they are going to want to equilibrate with one another. And so here is kind of the end result. So when you breach that space, the interpleural pressure becomes equal to the pressure that's in the lungs and also therefore in the atmosphere. And this causes the lung to collapse. So this is treated by removing the air with chest tubes. And when the pleura actually heal, the lung will reinflate itself. So this is just kind of a real life example of why maintaining this negative pressure in the intrapleural space is critical for keeping the lungs inflated. So now that we have discussed the various pressures that exist in the lungs, it's time to go ahead and talk about pulmonary ventilation, which again, remember, consists of inspiration or moving air from the atmosphere into the lungs, and expiration, moving air from the lungs back into the atmosphere. And a very important rule to keep in mind as we discuss this is that volume changes So as we change the volume in the lungs, that's going to lead to pressure changes in the lungs. And this pressure change in the lungs is then going to lead to the flow of gas in order to equalize that pressure. So let's talk a little bit about why this happens. Boyle's law is our mathematical principle behind why air flows into and out of the lungs based on these volume changes. So Boyle's law describes the relationship between pressure and volume of a gas. So it's a good rule to understand that gases will always fill the container that they're in. So if gas, so these little yellow dots are gas molecules, are placed in a pretty large container, or the volume is large, the pressure is going to be pretty low because the gas molecules are able to spread out pretty far. If the volume of the container gets smaller, so if the volume gets smaller, the gas molecules, as you can see, are forced closer together, and that is going to actually increase pressure. So from this relationship, we can see that pressure and volume are inverses of one another. So at high volumes, and I'll draw this for my visual mathematical people. So if we pick a point on this graph, and I'm going to pick this point right here, this is going to be equal to a pretty high volume, right? So high volume. If we look at its corresponding pressure, so, okay, my apologies, that was a pretty bad line. So if we look at its corresponding pressure, you can see that's going to be equal to a pretty low pressure. Alternatively, say we pick, I don't know, this point. We're going to pick this point as our second point. Looking at that point, in terms of its volume, so now we're talking about a pretty low volume over here, right? So this would be a low volume. But if we look at its matching pressure value, we can see that this pressure value is actually a pretty high pressure, okay? So pressure and volume vary inversely with one another, and mathematically speaking, P1 V1 equals P2 V2. So what this means is that your initial pressure and volume must equilibrate with your final pressure and volume. So for example, let's say we start out with a pressure of 2 and a volume of 2. That's going to be 2 times 2, which equals 4. Let's pretend like we have now increased the volume. So let's say now our volume is 4. So we've doubled our volume, and relating this to the lungs, this would be like when you breathe in and the lungs get bigger. What happens to the pressure inside of the lungs as the volume gets bigger? We remember we have to make this equal to 4. So the second pressure has to be 1 because these two values have to equal each other. So mathematically speaking, you can see that if one value goes up, so if the volume goes up, the pressure has to go down. And if the volume goes down, the pressure would go up. Okay, so this is going to be the basis in which we understand what exactly is going on in the lungs. So let's talk about that. Let's apply Boyle's law to inspiration. So applying Boyle's law to inspiration, first and foremost, it's important to remember that inspiration, to breathe in, this is an active process. Active processes in the body, as we know, are things that are going to require energy. And in this case, this requires energy in the form of the diaphragm and external intercostal muscles contracting. Okay, so let's remember how this works, that when the diaphragm contracts, it actually moves. Not a very big line there. So when the diaphragm contracts, it actually moves down, right? This then is going to create more space in the thoracic cavity. Would you agree? Additionally, as the external intercostal muscles contract, they lift the ribs sort of upward. And I know it kind of seems maybe a little bit confusing the way that this actually works. So the example that I drew down here is with a bucket. So when the bucket is just sitting on the ground, its handle is kind of like laying up against the side of it like this, right? And so you have about that much space between the handle and the bucket, or less, right? The bucket handle is going to represent the ribs, okay? So as the ribs expand, it's kind of like when you start to pick up the bucket by its handle, and the ribs actually then, as you can see, there's going to be more space between the bucket and the handle. It's going to be the same situation in the ribs, with the ribs, in which there's going to be more space in the thoracic cavity as the inspiratory muscles contract. This, as a general rule, just increases the volume in the thoracic cavity. Because of this, because we have now increased our volume of the thoracic cavity, this also, as we remember said a couple of slides ago, that the lungs are adhered, specifically the parietal pleura is adhered to the chest wall. So inherently, this will stretch the lungs. And as the lungs are stretched, so their volume is going to be increased. The volume of the lungs is going to increase, right? Because they're being stretched out. Because their volume is increased, our intrapulmonary pressure, or our, remember this one is the pupil, or intraalveolar pressure, remember? So this is the one, that the pressure that's inside the lungs. This is going to drop to 1 below atmospheric pressure, okay? It's going to drop. As a result, because now the pressure inside of the lungs is less than the pressure in the atmosphere, this is going to cause air or gases to flow into the lungs down their pressure gradients until intrapulmonary pressure is 0 or equal to atmospheric pressure. Okay, so volume increases. Let me just draw like a little summary snippet. During inspiration, the volume is going to increase. This is volume of the lungs increases, which leads to the pressure, the pupil, decreases. And now pupil is less than atmospheric, which means air flows into the lungs, right? So the volume of the lungs increases because of muscular contraction. So maybe I'll write that in there as well. So muscles contract, which increases the volume of the lungs, which decreases the pressure inside the lungs. And since the pressure is now lower than atmospheric pressure, air is going to flow from the atmosphere into the lungs. Okay, got it? In terms of expiration, or exhalation, if you will, it's a little bit different because exhalation or expiration is a normally passive process because it doesn't require energy in a sense that it's simply just the relaxation of the diaphragm and of the external intercostal muscles. So as those muscles are relaxing after they have contracted, as you can imagine, what happens is that the diaphragm moves back upwards. This is going to make less space in the thoracic cavity. Additionally, the bucket handles are going to go back to their relaxed state, or the ribs are going back to their relaxed state, which decreases the volume of the thoracic cavity. This is going to cause the lungs to recoil passively because now they have less space. So they're going to recoil. So as the volume of the lungs let's write our little notes. So what happened was muscles relaxed, which led to a decrease in the volume of the thoracic cavity, which led to recoil of the lungs, which decreases their volume. And because now the lung volume has decreased, that leads to an increased pressure in the lungs. Specifically, this is going to increase lung pressure to about positive 11 millimeters of mercury. So 11 above atmospheric pressure. So now that pressure has risen in the lungs, it wants to go to a place where there's lower pressure, and there's lower pressure in the atmosphere. So as the pressure in the lungs rises, air flows out of the lungs back into the environment. Now, I mentioned that this is normally a passive process, but as we all know, we can forcibly breathe out more if we have to. So if all of a sudden I was like, okay, breathe out all the extra air that you can, like push all the extra air that you can out of your lungs. That requires contraction of your oblique and transversus abdominis muscles, as well as your internal intercostal muscles. And simply all that this is doing is increasing this pressure inside the lungs even further. So this is 11 passively. Maybe you would increase it to like plus 20 or something. And so this would cause just a greater force of the air flowing out. It would just make the air flow out faster. Okay. So this table is just describing basically everything that I just talked about, and it's just showing you a comparison of the pressure in the lungs, the pressure in the pleural cavity as you inhale and as you exhale. And as you can see, during inhalation, the pressure is dropping. During exhalation, the pressure is rising. And this makes sense because as the volumes of the lungs are getting bigger, so increasing the volume, as we can see up here, decreases pressure. Okay. So this is just more like a summary slide. Now, as we have seen, the lungs, they're stretched during inspiration and they passively recoil during expiration, but and remember the inspiratory muscles are consuming energy to make the thorax bigger, but energy is also used by our bodies to overcome different factors that might hinder the passage of air from the environment to the lungs or vice versa. And so that's what we're going to talk about now is some other factors that the lungs have to overcome in order to excuse me, accomplish ventilation. So this is going to be airway resistance, the surface tension that exists in the alveolar surface, and then finally lung compliance. So in terms of the airway resistance, basically what this is the friction that occurs between the environment all the way down to the alveoli. And so as air is coming into contact with our nose, our mouth, our larynx, the trachea, the bronchi, those things all have surfaces. And so there's always a little bit of friction that's kind of resisting air from coming in. So mathematically speaking, flow or airflow in this case is going to be the difference, uh, it's going to be equal to the difference in pressure over the resistance that is present. Um, and again, remember friction is the major source of resistance to gas flow in the respiratory tract. So although resistance is present, it's not usually very significant. And the reason that it's not really significant is, first and foremost, the airways in the first part of the conducting zone are massive. So your trachea and your primary bronchi and secondary and tertiary bronchi, these are all really, really massive structures. So there's not a whole lot of obstruction to airflow. Additionally, even though as we branch further and further all the way down to like our alveoli, so remember I said that we go through like 23 orders of branching before we reach the alveoli. Um, Even though those passageways are super tiny, there are so many of them that it kind of, I guess, if you will, kind of wipes out the idea of resistance because there's just so many different pathways to take, and there's just not a whole lot of resistance when it comes to those terminal bronchioles and respiratory zone. Now, there is some resistance in medium-sized bronchi, as you can see here, but for the most part, airway resistance doesn't play a huge factor in pulmonary ventilation. Now, this could change if, for example, you had an obstruction in one of your bronchi or bronchioles. That obviously would significantly increase resistance, which could decrease the flow of air from environment to the alveoli and vice versa. Some other things that influence pulmonary ventilation and some things that we have to overcome in order to accomplish ventilation is the alveolar surface tension. And so the definition of surface tension is the attraction of liquid molecules to one another at a gas to liquid interface. And the way that I like to describe this one is think about a pond. So let's think about a pond. So thinking about that pond, I just drew a quick little pond for you guys. Um, you know those little bugs that will sit on pond water, and it literally looks like they're just floating there, and there might be like a little divot under their legs, but clearly they're not getting wet and they're not sinking. This is because between the atmosphere, the air, and the water exists what we call surface tension. The water has surface tension. And because the water molecules at this air to water interface want to be as close as possible to one another, it creates almost like a um almost like a, I guess, like a floaty kind of across the top of the pond, in which things that don't weigh very much can just sit on water, right? Without getting wet. They can't actually break the bond that exists between those water molecules. So if I were to draw some water molecules, because of hydrogen bonding that exists, and because the water molecules at this air to liquid interface are so close to one another, we have all these interconnections that keeps this little bug afloat. Okay, so that's what I mean by surface tension. There exists at an air to water interface, the water wants to be close as possible to one another. So let me bring my screen back up. Okay, so how this relates to the lungs is that here is our air to water interface. So inside the alveoli is an airspace, and then lining the alveoli, remember, is fluid. And this generates a really significant amount of surface tension, which tends to cause alveoli to shrink to their smallest size. So if you guys remember back a few slides ago when I drew my little impromptu alveolus that looked kind of like this, just like our little honeycomb situation going on, remember I drew in that there's water that lines these alveoli, and that water is attracted to one another, so it makes these alveoli want to collapse. That's what I mean by the surface tension that exists, because the water on this side is attracted to the water on this side and that side. It makes these want to assume the smallest possible position. Fortunately, in the lungs, we have been able to overcome this because of this stuff called surfactant that exists. And surfactant is kind of like dish soap. So you put a little bit of dish soap on this water, and all of a sudden, the water is no longer as attracted to one another. So surfactant molecules basically interpose themselves between the water and the air, and this actually will reduce surface tension. And this is what keeps the lungs, specifically the alveoli, from collapsing between each breath, because these tails down here are nonpolar. So if I were to continue this circle, if I were to continue to circle all the way around, like so, and all of this is still water, this water does not want to come near these nonpolar elements. Or rather, these nonpolar elements, I guess is the better way of saying it, don't want to come near the water because they're hydrophobic. So that keeps the water apart from one another in this circular type of environment of the alveoli, which then ultimately decreases the cohesiveness of the water molecules. The other thing that the lungs have to overcome in order to be successfully, to accomplish successful ventilation is their stretch. And so lung compliance measures the change in the volume of the lung that occurs with any given change in transpulmonary pressure, or basically when we're inhaling or exhaling. So pretty much what this measures is how much stretch the lung has available. It's kind of similar to preload with the heart. So how much the heart stretches when it's just finished diastole is very similar to lung compliance. Now, normally in normal folks here, the distensibility, or the elasticity of the lung tissue, is pretty high, and this, lung compliance is pretty high because the lung tissue is an elastic tissue. So normally it stretches pretty easy. And also remember that surfactant is there, which decreases the surface tension of the alveoli, which allows them to get bigger pretty easily. And that's the normal situation. However, in pathological states, high compliance means that you could have a really big change in volume with not a super big change in pressure. And if you don't change the pressure, then air has a hard time flowing in or out, as we know. So high compliance means that it's easier to expand the lungs than normal. So think about like emphysema causes this. And this is the case in which the lungs, they stretch really, really easily, but it's not creating a huge pressure change. And so without that big pressure change, air has a hard time flowing in. Sort of on the same but opposite side, low compliance or low stretchability means that the volume doesn't change a whole lot in the lungs, but it leads to massive changes in pressure. So now you have these crazy high pressure situations, or low pressure situations, in which that would certainly affect the ability of the lungs to participate in inspiration and exhalation. So things like pulmonary fibrosis, which is basically what you're doing effectively is replacing that stretchiness with fibrosis or with scar tissue, and scar tissue doesn't like to stretch. And another way that compliance could be lowered is if there is a problem with surfactant production. So if you don't make as much surfactant, then the lungs don't like, the alveoli specifically, don't like to stretch very much. And then finally, if for some reason the thoracic cage itself is unable to be as flexible as what it normally was before, that's another situation in which compliance would go down, okay? So those are just factors that the lungs have to overcome in order to maintain their ability to effectively inspire and expire. So that is all I'm going to do for this video. I'll come back in the next video and talk about different lung volumes and capacities and how we can measure that clinically. And then I'll make one more video that covers gas exchange, okay? So that's all for this one, and I will see you back on the next one.